Hey everybody, Josh Peck here. We're going to be doing something a little bit different today. We got no intro, so yeah, let's get started. Now, in 1704, Isaac Newton predicted the world will end in 2060. But what does that exactly mean? So we're going to look at an article that comes from openculture.com. If you want to check it out. But we've become used to pronouncements of doom, from scientists predicting the sixth mass extinction, climate change, due to measurable effects of climate change and stuff like that, and even from religionists declaring that the apocalypse is going to come at any moment due to the sin that we're offending God with, and it's almost impossible to imagine that these two groups of people could agree on anything other than the ominous portent of their respective messages. But in the early days of the scientific revolution, the days of Shakespeare contemporary Francis Bacon, and later 17th century Descartes, in these days, it was not at all unusual to find both kinds of reasoning, or even unreasoning, if you look at it that way, in the same person, along with beliefs in magic, divination, astrology, all that kind of stuff. Yet, even with all this going on, with all these thoughts and practices, Sir Isaac Newton stood out as a particularly odd coexistence of esoteric biblical prophecy, occult beliefs, and a rigid formal mathematics that not only adhered to the inductive scientific method, but also expanded its potential by applying general axioms to specific cases. But many of Newton's general principles would seem totally inimical to the naturalism of most of physics today. It'd just be out there. As he was formulating the principles of gravity and three laws of motion, Newton also sought the legendary philosopher's stone and attempted to turn metal to gold. To modern physicists today, that would seem very strange. Although, as I've talked about before, that's essentially what is happening at the LHC at CERN. They're in a sense changing one material to another. Through a proton collision, they can bring a Higgs boson into existence. It's not that you combine two protons and it's not like the pieces of the protons are still in the Higgs boson. These are two entirely different particles. But that's a whole other conversation. Now, moreover, the devotedly religious Newton wrote theological treatises interpreting Bible prophecies and predicting the end of the world. And the date that he arrived at was the year 2060. So, Newton seems, writes science blog Another Pale Blue Dot, quote, as confident of his prediction in this realm as he was in the rational world of science, end quote. So in a 1704 letter exhibited at Jerusalem's Hebrew University, Newton describes his reckoning as this, quote, so then the times and half a time are 42 months, or 1,260 days, or 3 years and a half, reckoning 12 months to a year and 30 days to a month, as was done in the calendar of the primitive year. And the days of short-lived beasts being put for the years of lived kingdoms, the period of 1,260 days, if dated from the complete conquest of the three kings, AC 800, will end AC 2060. It may end later, but I see no reason for its ending sooner, end quote. Now, Newton further demonstrated his confidence in the next sentence, writing that his intent, quote, though not to assert, end quote, an answer, should in any event, quote, put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men who are frequently predicting the time of the end, end quote. Isn't that interesting that was going on in his time, and we still see that today? It seems like every couple of years, every couple of months, really, you get somebody new online that's saying that the world, the rapture is going to happen, or Jesus is returning in the following month. But how did he arrive at this number? How did Newton arrive at this number? Newton applied a rigorous method. So if you have patience for like an exhaustive description of how he worked out his prediction using the book of Daniel, you can read You can read a description linked at openculture. I believe that's what it was. Openculture.com. Is that what I said? Yeah. Openculture.com. There's in the article that we're looking at today, which is titled "In 1704, Isaac Newton predicts the world will end in 2060." There's a link, and if you click on that link, you can read one there by historian of science Stephen Snowbelin. And we might look at some of Snowbelin's stuff in another video. But he also points out how widespread the interest in Newton's odd beliefs have become, reaching across every continent. Though scholars have known about about this side of the Enlightenment giant for quite a while. But now for a sense of the exacting yet completely bizarre flavor of Newton's prophetic calculations, you can see another Newton letter at the that we can look at here, and it's transcribed. I have this transcribed for you, so let me see if screen share will work here. Let's see what we got. Yeah, there we go. Wasn't for sure if screen share was going to work because without having my Stream Deck thing, a lot of the functions usually available in my OBS studio here aren't functioning. But anyway, so here's a transcript. So here, Prop 1, the 2,300 prophetic days did not commence before the rise of the little horn of the he-goat. Those days, did not commence after the destruction of Jerusalem and temple by the Romans AD 70. The times, and half a time did not commence before the year 800, in which the Pope's supremacy commenced. They did not commence after the reign of Gregory VII in 1084. The 1290 days did not commence before the year 842. They did not commence after the reign of Pope Gregory VII, 1084. The difference between the 1290 and 1335 days are a part of the 7 weeks. Therefore, the 2300 years do not end before the year 2132, nor after 2370. The times, and half time do not end before 2060, nor after 2344. And lastly, the 1290 days do not begin. This should read end. So the 1290 days do not end before 2090. Newton might mean 2132. Nor after 1374. So Newton probably means 2374. Some of it's an old document, so some of it's kind of hard to get a handle on. But so that's what he was looking at. Now, these editorial insertions are Professor Snowbelin's insertions, who thinks that the letter dates, quote, from after 1705, end quote, and that, quote, the shaky handwriting suggests a date of composition late in Newton's life, end quote. But whatever the exact case, we see him much less certain in this. So Newton pushes around some other dates, 2344, 2090, or 2132, 2374. All of them seem arbitrary, but, quote, given the niche roundness of this number, and the fact that it appears in more than one letter, end quote, 2060 has become his most memorable dating for the apocalypse. And that quote was from Motherboard. So it's important to note that Newton didn't believe the world would end exactly, in the sense of cease to exist or burn up in holy flames. His end times philosophy resembles that of a surprising number of current day evangelicals, that Christ would return and reign for a millennium. The Jewish diaspora would return to Israel and would, as he wrote, set up, quote, a flourishing and everlasting kingdom, end quote. So we hear such statements often from televangelists, school boards, governors, presidential candidates, all that kind of stuff. Now, as many people have argued, despite Newton's conception of his scientific work as a bulwark against other theologies, it ultimately became a foundation for deism and naturalism that has allowed scientists to make accurate predictions for hundreds of years. So 20th century physics may have shown us a much more radically unstable universe than Newton ever imagined. But his theories are, as Isaac Asimov would put it, quote, not so much wrong as incomplete, end quote, and still essential to our understanding of certain fundamental phenomena. But as fascinating and curious as Newton's other interests may be, there's no more reason to credit his prophetic calculation than those of the Millerites, Harold Camping, or any other apocalyptic doomsday sect. At least that, again, is the opinion of the author here in Open Culture.
Hey everyone. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there is a big difference between real money and what we call money, which is actually currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, like silver, is a store of value over time. The best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash back in the late 60s, the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000 today, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. Now, if you saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 1960s, it would be around $28,000 today. So one of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically, silver. Now, you can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even your 401k into physical silver rather than having all your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is, of course, subject to hyperinflation. So go to dailyrenegade.com right now and click on the Cornerstone Asset Metals banner and sign up to get your free silver report. One of the financial experts will speak with you and find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times. You can also click on the link in the description below that goes directly to cornerstoneassetmetals.com. Make sure you tell them that Josh Peck at Daily Renegade sent you. It is time to stop trusting the evil beast financial system of the world and protect your assets today.
Speaking of Stephen Snowbellin, he has an article that can be found at isaac-newton.org, and it's just titled Statement on the Date 2060. So he writes on February 22nd, 2003, the Daily Telegraph from London, England, published a front-page story announcing Isaac Newton's prediction that the world would end in 2060. The story was based on interviews with Snowbellin and Malcolm Newham, the producer of the BBC Two documentary Newton, the Dark Heretic, which was first shown on March 1st, 2003. Snowbellin was asked to make himself available to the media because some of his academic research on Newton's prophecy and heretical theology was used in the documentary. And since he was not only interviewed for the documentary both in Jerusalem and Cambridge, but also shown the manuscript containing the 2060 date in Jerusalem. Now, although the 2060 date was not news to the small community of scholars who study Newton's theology, this was the first time the wider public became aware of Newton's prophetic views. So over the next few days, the news spread around the globe and was covered in newspapers, making the front pages in Israel and Canada on February 23rd and 24th, respectively. On the radio, on TV, and on a plethora of internet news sites. So the story was covered on the internet in all major European languages, from English, French, Spanish to Hungarian, Romanian, even Russian. Websites in South America, South Africa, Australia, China, Vietnam, and India also covered this story. And many of these websites picked up the story second and third hand. Several of them treated the story as kind of a joke, with one site including a picture of a mushroom cloud, which was an image that's more readily associated with Einstein, with the caption, quote, "Party like it's 2060," end quote. So for almost a week, Snowbellin says that he received a barrage of requests for interviews from the media, CBC Radio and TV, Global TV, and the Maritimes, Agent France Press, and the largest talk show in Chicago, and even the Russian section of Radio Free Europe, which aired the interview in Russian translation. So he tried to use this unexpected opportunity to fill in more details about Newton's theological and prophetic thought, and to point out that Newton's apocalyptic thought was not just doom and destruction. Now, although there was a sensational element in the way that the news was covered by many media organizations at the time, the story has performed a really important role in alerting the public to the fact that Isaac Newton was not merely a scientist, but was a theologian and a prophetic exegete, not to mention also an alchemist. Now, the public was therefore challenged to reconceptualize Newton in all his complexity. The BBC Two documentary, with its visual impact and much greater detail, challenged its viewers in an even more profound way. So that brings up the question, why did Newton's prediction for 2060 become such a big news story? One reason why Newton's, what Snoblin refers to as Newton's heresy, apocalyptic thought and prediction about the 2060 date, became news in February of 2003 is because most members of the media and the public had no idea that Newton was anything other than a scientist. This came as big news. For many, this revelation that Newton was a passionate believer who, took biblical prophecy seriously came as a shock. So it seems that both the media and the general public have a notion of Newton as a rational scientist that makes it difficult to absorb the knowledge that Newton was practicing both alchemy and prophetic exegesis, studies that many see as antithetical to the enterprise of science. But the media has perpetuated a myth that science and religion are inherently in conflict. But the fact is, sometimes they are. It depends on the interpretation of the science, and it depends on the belief. But religion has also often stimulated the development of science. And actually, it's not really the case that physicists today are all non-spiritual. A lot of times they'll say that. Like a lot of times, it seems like the grand majority of physicists or scientists are materialists. But I interviewed Dr. Ronald Mallett. He's been studying black holes and time travel, and he's had documentaries made about him. I interviewed him for a book that I did a while ago for Unraveling the Multiverse. And in that, I asked him. I said, "Is it true that?" Because he's a Christian. Dr. Ronald Mallett is a Christian, and I asked him, "Is that difficult? Is it true that?" It's really hard to do anything in science and be a Christian. And he said, no, that's basically, he said, that's media hype. He said that when you get into, the scientific field, even, take physicists, take any group, you kind of get a little of everything, just like you would in just the general population. If you take 100 people out of the general population, you're going to get some Christians, you're going to get some New Agers, you're going to get some atheists, you're going to get some Buddhists, He said it's a lot like that. So there's a lot more Christians today in science than we are led to believe, which is encouraging. But it's just that they don't get the airtime. He said that's why it seems like there's like no Christians in science today. There are, they just don't get the airtime. The people that do get the airtime are the materialists, sometimes even the New Agers. That has risen significantly in the past couple of decades, the infiltration of New Age into quantum physics. And many quantum physicists are falling for it. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. But they still consider themselves as non-religious or non-spiritual. But they constantly interpret their own findings or the findings of other physicists in these weird New Agey kind of ways. So you see that quite a bit. So it's not really the case that all scientists today are materialist and are completely against Christianity. There is some of that, but the media hypes this up. So now the story about Newton predicting the apocalypse in 2060 is the sort of thing that one would expect to see on the covers of tabloids. But in this case, the story is actually true. Now, ironically, the tabloids did not cover the story, and maybe it's because this story, although it's counterintuitive to many people, is actually authentic. So maybe that's why the tabloids didn't cover it. But there's likely another reason why so many found the story about Newton in 2060 so compelling. When the story broke, storm clouds of war were on the horizon. There was concern about the predicted war in Iraq, which is now a fulfilled prophecy. Not literally, we're using that figuratively, but there were concerns about a predicted war in Iraq, which came true, which actually happened. Probably, in that fact, probably heightened the public's interest in Newton's date for the end of the world, particularly because the pending war involved the nation who occupies the land of ancient Babylon, which is a land that figures prominently in biblical prophecy and in Newton's own prophetic writings. Now, the head of the department in charge of the Newton collection in Jerusalem, in a TV interview, pointed directly to the threat of war in Iraq as one reason for the interest in the story. Reviewing footage of 2 Canadian television news items on the 2060 story, Snowblin says that he was struck by its placement in the midst of images of U.S. troops and helicopters arriving in Kuwait, along with statements about the pending war from presidential spokesman Ari Fleischer. Now, it's clear that whether we are religious or secular, we're living in apocalyptic times, right? At least people are looking for it, you know. India, Pakistan, North Korea, they're all rattling nuclear sabers. You have jetliners flying to skyscrapers laden with kerosene and human bodies. Terrorists strike around the world. Just recently, North Korea is shooting missiles to God knows where. And, also beginning around the time of that documentary aired was the SARS outbreak, if you remember that, appearing seemingly out of nowhere like a biblical plague. And, but of course, like everything else, the media hyped it up more than what it really was. But so that was in people's minds. And then there were concerns about the degradation of our environment and fears of a coming eco-apocalypse, which of course people have been warning about for decades now, and it has yet to come. But in the context of these troubling realities, a dramatic story about the greatest scientist of all time predicting the end of the world carried with it added potency and poignancy. Now, strangely, a couple of months after the 2060 story broke, Sir Martin Rees, which is one of today's leading scientists, he published a book entitled "Our Final Hour, Our Final Century in the UK," in which he argues that the human race has only a 50-50 chance of surviving the 21st century. So apocalypticism, hard word to say, is not the exclusive domain of the lunatic fringe on either sides of a religion or science. It's a broader phenomenon that reflects humanity's insecurity about the apparent fragility and tenuousness of our existence on planet Earth. And I believe that when it's handled correctly, that can actually teach some humility. When it's handled correctly, when it's not something that's like fear-based, but when it's actually handled correctly, that can teach us humility. We're not going to be around forever. There is going to be a time Jesus returns. I believe that it was done by design why we don't have an exact date of Jesus' return. I think we as humans, we as Christians kind of criticize the fact that every generation has thought that they're the last generation. I'm not, and I used to be really critical of that too. But the reason I was critical of it was because I would look at the fringes of those groups. You look at the crazy people that publish books and say the world is going to end next year or something. But that actual mindset, I actually think that mindset, not going off into lunatic fringe territory, but the mindset can be a healthy thing. If we believe that there's at least a strong possibility we could be the last generation, and not run off into lunatic land with it, that's going to keep us focused on task. We should be more motivated to reach people with the gospel, to get as many people saved as possible before the end comes. Now, again, I'm not talking about if an asteroid hits and blows up the world and we need to fear that, but I'm talking about if we think that Jesus could return in our lifetime, but we also have humility to know that we don't know everything, and that might not be the case. I believe that's a really healthy balance. And I think that's where we as Christians want to be. And I actually think that's where a lot of Christians are. But it's just the lunatic fringe. They get the airtime. So the Harold Campings of the world get the airtime. Whereas people like you and me don't. I'm not getting any interview requests from CNN to talk about the end of the world, for example, because I'm not predicting any. I don't set dates on that kind of stuff. Do I believe that we're in the last generation? I believe it's very possible, but it also wouldn't surprise me. I'll tell you what. I think more about my own death than I do about the end of the world. And the reason is because, again, the humility, we have to realize every generation has thought that theirs was going to be the last, and they've all been wrong. Now, how many people got too caught up in thinking that they were going to, let's say, get raptured out of here, and they didn't take any time contemplating their own physical death? And that to me would be kind of a scary place to be in. You know, if you're caught up, if you're thinking, I remember, for me personally, I remember when I was much younger, I never gave any thought to my own death whatsoever. And when I say thought, I don't mean fear, because of course we don't need to fear it, but we should think about it, you know. But I never gave any thought to it because I was so convinced that the rapture was going to happen at any day now that I just never gave it any thought. Now, anything could have happened. When I was in that mindset, I could have got hit by a car. I could have been killed. And I would have spent my life not giving any thought to what that moment was going to be like, or preparing myself for it, or really making sure that I'm right with Jesus. How many other people have been caught up in that? So that's where it can get dangerous. So now personally, I think more about my own death, because look, if the Lord returns, when the Lord returns, if it is in my lifetime, if it's a rapture, I don't really have to spend a lot of time thinking about that, because bam, we're caught up, you know. So if that is the correct interpretation of the rapture, that's not the same. If you're in the rapture, you're good, right? But your own death, everybody has died, right? I mean, so we have to pay attention to that. We should be paying attention to that. We should think about it, contemplate it, you know, not obsess and fear over it, but you know, we should get a handle as best we can on what's going to happen, what it's going to be like, what our standing with Jesus is, because that day ultimately is going to come, and when it does, there's no going back. There's no do-overs. You know, you're sealed in eternity at that point. So I think that's important.
A divine miracle shook the archaeological world in 1947 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves of Qumran. A young shepherd boy was throwing rocks into the caves when he heard the sound of breaking pottery. What he discovered would prove that the Bible we hold in our hands today has not been changed over the last 2,000 years, giving us a new appreciation for the Jewish scribes and the Essenes, who painstakingly copied the scriptures for our benefit. Secreted away in these caves were scrolls that contained 38 of the Old Testament's 39 books. The most spectacular discovery was a well-preserved copy of the Isaiah scroll, which contained all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, an important book that highlights the qualifications of the Jewish Messiah. Ironically, just 1 year later, Israel was regathered in their ancient homeland, one of the great miracles of modern history. Working together with Ken Johnson, Josh crafted the Essene calendar, the original calendar that God gave to Adam. Over the centuries, this God-ordained calendar was corrupted by Jewish rabbis, with many believing there was a hidden agenda in play, a conspiracy to hide the prophetic qualifications of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. The Essenes knew when the Messiah was scheduled to arrive. They knew he would be God in human flesh and that he'd be killed to take on the sins of the world. And shockingly, they seemed to know the day when God's calendar comes to a close and the 1,000-year millennium begins. This unique, one-of-a-kind calendar can be yours for your gift of $25 or more, with shipping included in the USA. Call our toll-free number 24/7 or visit us online at prophecywatchers.tv. For our international friends, please note that additional shipping fees do apply and all prices listed are in US dollars. From Jubilee cycles to Shemitah cycles and a deep dive into the Jewish feast days, no stone is left unturned. Amazingly, the scrolls tell us that there weren't just 7 Jewish feast days, there were 12. Josh even shares his thoughts on the mysterious disappearance of the Essenes in his 2 books that total almost 800 pages. Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Book 1 and 2, may represent the most comprehensive studies ever done on the Essenes and their controversial calendar, which has us all wondering, will Jesus return in our lifetime? Get your own personal copies of these 2 books for your gift of $60 or more, and as always, shipping is included in the USA. When you place your order, we'll include a special bonus, a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar that you've heard about today. Call us toll-free at the number you see on your screen and ask about the Forgotten Prophecies calendar package. We invite you to partner with us so we can keep our television program coming into homes all over the world, including almost 2 million homes in Israel. Most of all, we want to introduce the Jewish people to their Messiah, Jesus Christ.
But that's that good balance. So, I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, but this is what I say. That's that good balance. I mean, that's the balance that I'm striving for, that I try to strive for. A healthy balance between believing that it's a strong possibility that we could be in the last generation, and I do believe that. I wouldn't bet on it, but I do believe it. But at the same time saying, okay, well, whatever happens with that's interesting, and we'll look into it, but I'll even do presentations about it. I'll go and speak at conferences about it. I do that all the time. I'll do shows about it. And that's great. It's a good thing to do. But I want to use that as motivation to get out there, get people saved, tell people about Jesus, support ministries who are going to Israel to preach the gospel to the Jewish people. I want to do that, not focus so much on the doom and gloom stuff. Same with mortality, same with knowing that I'm going to die someday. I don't want to focus on the doom and gloom stuff over that. But I want to focus on what does that really mean? What is that going to be like? What's my standing with Jesus today? And could it be better tomorrow if I'm blessed to have it tomorrow? Because none of us are guaranteed another day on this earth, and none of us are getting out of this alive. So I think those are all really good points to keep in mind through this whole thing. So let's get back to Newton. Newton's theological and alchemical papers were kept from public scrutiny by the Portsmouth family until 1936, when they were sold at Sotheby's in London. The largest single collection of the theological papers was acquired by the Jewish scholar Abraham Shalom Ezekiel Yehuda. Now, when he died in 1951, he left them to the newly founded state of Israel. His will was contested, and thus the manuscripts did not arrive in Israel until 1969, when they were brought to the Jewish National and University Library in Jerusalem. It was only after this point that scholars had access to this particular collection of papers. But the manuscripts were only conveniently accessible to scholars after the majority of Newton's scientific, administrative, theological, and alchemical manuscripts were released on microfilm in 1991. So since 1991, there has been a revolution in Newton scholarship as the theological manuscripts began to be assessed in earnest by a small group of specialist scholars. A significant element of this revolution was the founding in 1998 of the Newton Project, based at Imperial College London and the University of Cambridge. This project has already begun the process of transcribing Newton's unpublished theological manuscripts in order to make them accessible to the world. Now, the BBC Two documentary revealed to the wider public that for the first time and in dramatic fashion, the results of this recent revolution in the understanding of Newton's life work. So the announcement about the 2060 date must be seen in this context. Now, although the initial Daily Telegraph article did not make that claim, some subsequent, or make this claim that we're getting to, some subsequent media reports mistakenly attributed the discovery of the 2060 date in Newton's writings to Snoblin himself. But he says that's not the case. Other media reports, which were based on direct interviews with Snoblin, correctly stated that the 2060 date has been known for quite some time, but only amongst Newton scholars and academic publications. Unlike television documentaries, generally do not make news. So, at least three important Newton scholars, David Castileo, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Frank Manuel, and Richard Westphal, examined the Yehuda manuscripts, either in the original copies or, in the case of Westphal, in microfilm reproductions shortly after the arrival in Jerusalem. Now, in 1969, Castileo was likely the first to encounter the 2060 date, as he was the first scholar to examine the Yehuda collection. He published the 2060 date in his 1981 work called The Expanding Force in Newton's Cosmos, specifically on page 55. Westphal published the date in his 1980 biography of Newton, titled Never at Rest, which can be found in pages 816 to 817. Snoblin first came across the date in his own research as opposed to reading it in Castillejo or Westphal when he was studying Yehuda MS-7 on microfilm while a PhD student at the University of Cambridge in he was a PhD student at the University of Cambridge in 1997 while he did this. So he published the date in his 1999 British Journal for the History of Science paper called Isaac Newton, Heretic, The Strategies of a Nicodemite, pages 391 to 392. The real story is not the discovery of the 2060 date, but that Newton's non-scientific work is being made known to the public in a spectacular manner. So, now that we have all of the context here, how important was biblical prophecy for Isaac Newton? Extremely important. So for Newton, biblical prophecy forecast the divinely ordained events of the future. He believed the interpretation of biblical prophecy was, quote, no matter of indifferency, but a duty of the greatest moment, end quote. So prophecy allowed Newton to see history in advance. It also identified an evil apostate system, Babylon, that pure Christians must flee to avoid destruction and the wrath of God. So how does Bible prophecy work for Newton? Newton believed both in God and that the Bible was a revelation from God. He also believed that God was not bound by time as we humans are, allowing him to see the end from the beginning. So to use Newton's own words, he was convinced that, quote, the holy prophecies, end quote, of the scripture are nothing else than, quote, histories of things to come, end quote. And that is found in the Yehuda MS 1.1, folio 16 recto. Now, at the same time, biblical prophecy is written in highly symbolic language, much of it is, that requires skilled interpretation. Newton rose to this challenge as he attempted to discover the future of the world in the words of the prophets. Now, Newton only rarely added up the prophetic numbers. So why did Newton only rarely add up the prophetic numbers? Well, this was because he was wary of prophetic date setting. So Newton was worried that the failure of fallible human predictions based on divine prophecy would bring the Bible into disrepute. Ironically, in one of the two times that Newton wrote down the 2060 date, he railed against date setters. So Newton may have been aghast if he had known his prediction would be broadcast around the world in the 21st century. His calculations about the 2060 date were private musings that he made on a scrap of paper, not really meant for the public. This was his own private notes. Now, ironically, the media coverage of the 2060 date has made Newton look like a date setter. But, apparently Newton himself was very much against that. So, it's one thing, it's one thing if we ourselves are trying to figure things out and we kind of keep that to ourselves. But to broadcast it out to the world, Newton had an issue with that. Now let's take a look at the logic of Newton's apocalyptic calculations. Now, Newton, like many history prophetic commentators, I keep wanting to say historistic. All right, anyway, prophetic commentators of his age believe that the prophetic time periods, 1260, 1290, 1335, and 2300 days, actually represent 1260, 1290, 1335, and 2300 years, using what's called the day for a year principle. So for Newton, these time periods, especially in the 1260 years, represent the time span of the apostasy of the church. And for Newton, this means the Trinitarian church, chiefly the Catholics. So he looked in history for the likely date when the apostasy formally began. One sign of this for him was the date when the papal church obtained temporal power. Now, from there, it was a simple matter of just adding the time period to the beginning date. But, things are rarely so simple with Newton. So, as already mentioned, Newton looked looked negatively towards date setting, and for this reason he rarely wrote out the end date for a time period once he had settled on a beginning date. There is a small number of exceptions, and the date 2060, found twice in the Yehuda manuscript at Jerusalem, is one of them. The date 2060 is also significant because, in addition to the rarity of end dates in Newton's writings, the calculation giving the 2060 date comes from fairly late in his life and is asserted with uncharacteristic vigor. Now, finding the commencement date was of great importance to Newton, since he had, once he added the prophetic time periods to this date, he was able to determine when the great apocalyptic events of the end of the world were going to occur. Now, although Newton believed there would be wars and cataclysms around the time of the end, for him, this period was also the storm before the calm. So Newton's prophetic faith was, to him, it was like a positive element. So some of the prophetic time periods here. There's a time period of 1,260 days that appears in Daniel 7:25. Which is, as a time and times and the dividing of time, so a year, 2 years, and half a year. Daniel 12:7 says as a time, times, and a half, or a year, 2 years, and half a year. Revelation 11:3 it says 1,260 days. Revelation 12:6 says 1,260 days. And then Revelation 13:5 says 42 months. So then another one is the time period of 1,290 days, which appears in Daniel 12:11. There's also in the following verse, there's a period of 1,335 days, and again, that appears in Daniel 12:12. And then there's the time period of 2,300 days, which occurs in Daniel 8:14. So how did Newton arrive at the date 2060? That's what everybody wants to know. And we needed all of that back context to get here. So that's why I wanted to put all of this in one video instead of splitting it up into two. Now, this did not involve the use of anything as complicated as calculus, which he invented, but rather just simple arithmetic. So the simple arithmetic could be performed by a child, actually. So beginning in the 1670s and continuing to the end of his life in 1727, Newton considered several commencement dates, several beginning dates for the formal institution of the apostate imperial church. Now, earlier commencement dates include 607 and 609 AD. But as Newton grew older, he pushed the time of the end further and further into the future. So in Yehuda manuscript 7, Newton twice gives 800 AD for the beginning of the Pope's supremacy. Now, the year 800 is a significant one in history, as it's the year Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of Rome in the West by Pope Leo III at St. Peter's in Rome. Since Newton believed that the 1260 years corresponded to the duration of the corruption of the church, he added 1,260 years to 800 AD, and he arrived at the date 2060 for the fall of Babylon. So I mean that's pretty easy to understand. That's pretty simple. But this date, again, it was for the fall of Babylon, or the cessation of the apostate church. Now, it seems that Newton believed the fall could perhaps begin somewhat before the end of the 1,260-year period and continue for a short time afterward. Whatever the precise chronology, Newton believed that sometime shortly after the fall of the corrupt, which again to him was the Trinitarian Catholic Church, Christ would return and set up a 1,000-year kingdom of God on earth.
I have just started a Substack. What is a Substack, you might ask? It is a place that contains early access to audio-only podcast versions of full Daily Renegade videos, plus my personal blog, which includes original articles, show notes, interview transcripts, and so much more. This is the only place to get this amazing resource, and it is not available to the general public. Adding a subscription to my Substack to your Daily Renegade membership will ensure that you have full access to every format of everything that I do. So head on over to joshpeck.substack.com or click on the link in the description below to join up now for only $5 a month or $50 a year. And if you can do it, I suggest doing the $50 a year because it's cheaper in the long run, and essentially you get 2 months for free. So I cannot wait to see you there. Take care and God bless.
On page 144 of his Observations, 1733, Newton cited Daniel 7:26 through 27 as evidence of this, which says, "But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints for the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." Now, Newton espoused a premillenarian eschatology, premillennial prophetic interpretation. And so he held that Christ would return to earth to establish the millennium. Now, there's two examples of the date 2060 in the Yehuda manuscript 7:3. And that's from the Jewish National and University Library in Jerusalem. So let's see here. Yeah, I'll switch to screen share so we can follow along with this because there's some comments that go along with it too. So okay, this is 7.3 folio 3 verse 13 verso. So then the time, times, and half a time are 42 months, or 1,260 days, or 3 years and a half, reckoning 12 months to a year and 30 days to a month, as was done in the calendar of the primitive year. So this is what we looked at before. And the days of short-lived beasts being put for the years of lived kingdoms, the period of 1260 days, if dated from the complete conquest of the three kings, which is AC 800, will end AC 2060. It may end later, but I see no reason for its ending sooner. This I mention not to assert the time of the end shall be, but to put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men who are frequently predicting the time of the end, and by doing so bring the sacred prophecies into discredit as often as their predictions fail. Christ comes as a thief in the night, and it is not for us to know the times and seasons which God hath put into his own breast. So even here, he's railing against date setters. So here's some comments. This excerpt demonstrates that Newton was not only reluctant to set dates, but that he was convinced the end would not come in his lifetime. He took seriously biblical passages that assert that no one except God knows the time of the end. Nevertheless, this excerpt shows that even Newton was fascinated with the prophetic conundrum of the date for the return of Christ and the beginning of the millennium. Finally, although Newton's statement was meant to demonstrate that the time of the end was several centuries away from his perspective, history has now caught up with his predictions, which helps explain the current interest in his apocalyptic calculations. All right, now let's look at the second one. This is 7.30 folio 8R, and we'll look at the comments too. Let's see how far these go down. All right. Prop 1, the 2300 prophetic days did not commence before the rise of the little horn of the he-goat. Those days did not commence after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, AD 70. The time, times, and half a time did not commence before the year 800, in which the Pope's supremacy commenced. They did not commence after the reign of Gregory VII in 1084. The 1290 days did not commence before the year 842. They did not commence after the reign of Pope Gregory VII 1084. The difference between the 1290 and 1335 days are a part of the 7 weeks. Therefore, the 2300 years do not end before the year 2132, nor after 2370. The times and half time do not end before 2060, nor after 2344. The 1290 days did not begin, and again, this should read end, did not end before 2090, and again, Newton might mean 2132, nor after 1374, and again, Newton probably means 2374. So we looked at those before, so we can look at some of these comments now. These calculations are written on a letter slip addressed to Sir Isaac Newton, and thus dating from after 1705 when Newton was knighted. In fact, the shaky handwriting suggests the date of composition late in Newton's life. The manuscript fragment contains a number of interesting features, including the remnants of the red wax seal and a series of mathematical calculations. Thus, this sheet exhibits both mathematical calculations and calculations for the end of the world. It is this manuscript fragment that is shown at the end of the BBC Two documentary, Newton, the Dark Heretic. When viewing the Yehuda manuscripts in Jerusalem on December 9th, 2002, the day before the Jerusalem footage was shot for the documentary, and I think this is Snoblin talking here, selected this manuscript as one of a series of worthy candidates to film. My reasons were as follows. Not only does this letter slip show a date in Newton's hand that is relevant to us today, but it is also visually interesting with its red wax seals, mathematical calculations, and prophetic chronology, all of which helps provide an insight into the range of Newton's thought. Of course, only one thing emerged from this manuscript in the documentary, the date 2060 AD. Okay, so Newton actually didn't believe in a literal sense that the world would end in 2060. So for Newton, again, just to kind of reiterate this, because it's important to understand what Newton actually believed. For Newton, 2060 AD would be more like a new beginning. It would be the end of an old age and the beginning of a new era. The era that Jews refer to the Messianic age, and the era premillennial Christians term the Millennium Kingdom or Kingdom of God. So Newton was convinced that Christ would return around this date and establish a global kingdom of peace. So it would stand to reason if you're a premillennial rapture believer, it would stand to reason if Christ returns on 2060, then the beginning of the tribulation would be 2053, something like that, and the rapture sometime before that. But again, it's all conjecture. It's all opinions, and even Newton railed against date setters. So we're not doing that. But if you do the math, that's kind of what it would be. But he believed that Christ would return around this date and establish a global kingdom of peace. Babylon, which again to him was the global Trinitarian Church, Catholic Church, would also fall, and the true gospel would be preached openly. Before the second coming, the Jews would return to Israel according to the predictions made in Bible prophecy, and of course that occurred in 1948. The temple would be rebuilt as well. We are seeing the beginning signs of that now, and that very well could happen very soon. Now, slightly before or around the time of Christ's return, the Great Battle of Armageddon would take place, in his opinion, when a series of nations, the Gog and Magog confederacy of Ezekiel's prophecy, would invade Israel. Christ and the saints would then intervene to establish a worldwide 1,000-year kingdom of God on earth. Citing the prophet Micah, Newton believed this kingdom would usher in a time of peace and prosperity, a time when people would, quote, beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, end quote, and when, quote, nations shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, end quote. And that, of course, comes from Micah chapter 4, verse 3. Now, although the documentary chose not to focus on this message of hope, Newton did believe that there would be a positive outcome to the war and destruction that would take place at the time of the end. Newton took seriously the prophetic vision of world peace found in Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, a vision that sees Jerusalem as the beginning of peace. So it is thus perhaps appropriate that the largest collection of Newton's prophetic papers now resides in Jerusalem. So why are his theological and prophetic beliefs important to our understanding of Newton? It's because Newton was not a scientist in the modern sense of that term. Or you could say that scientists today are not real scientists in the actual sense of the word. Ancient scientists were they used science as a tool to understand the material world, but they also had a spiritual side to them. Many of them did. And Newton fell in that camp. But, Newton was more of like a natural philosopher. So, practiced from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, natural philosophy included not only the study of nature, but also the study of God's hand at work in nature. Newton was committed to a notion of natural philosophy that saw the discovery of God and his attributes as its chief end. So for this reason, any serious study of Newton's natural philosophy must include an understanding of his theological views. So for example, Newton's famous concept of absolute space and time were fundamentally based on his notion of God's omnipresence and eternal duration. It's also clear from his private manuscripts that Newton believed the ideal natural philosopher would also be a priest of nature. So for Newton, there was no impermeable barrier between religion and what we now call science. Throughout his life, Newton labored to discover God's truth, whether in nature or scripture. Although he recognized disciplinary distinctions, Newton believed that truth was one. So Newton's study of nature and scripture were, in a certain sense, two halves of a whole, the discovery of the mind of God. Now, there's more information on Newton's attempts to date the end of the world. You can find further details on Newton's end-time calculations on pages 391 and 393 of Snoblin's paper entitled Isaac Newton, Heretic, from the year 1999, and pages 106 and 108 of his paper, The Mystery of This Restitution of All Things, from 2001. Both these essays are available on the website that Isaac-Newton, is that .com or .org? That is .org. Isaac-Newton.org. You can find those papers there. More elaborate studies of Newton's eschatology appears in Snoblin's paper, A Time and Times and the Dividing of Time, Isaac Newton, The Apocalypse in 2060 AD, and in his forthcoming book, which might be out now. I don't know the date of this, but entitled Isaac Newton, Heretic. Turns out there's some more interesting stuff about Isaac Newton that I wanted to talk about. In a larger context, though, this idea of trying to develop a universal language, it's a pretty old pursuit. Newton even tried his hand at it. And, that leads us to wonder, is this an attempt to get around the curse of Babel? Tower of Babel, everybody's getting together and doing this thing that God really had a problem with. So he came down, split everybody all up, gave everybody different languages. Now we already have the ability to learn other languages if we put the time and effort into it. We can, anybody can learn any language. If you give it enough time, if you're motivated to do so. So is the idea of universal language, is that something that might show up prophetically? I mean, there have been attempts at this for a long time. And, with prophetic things like having a one world religion, a one world government, doesn't it stand to reason that maybe something like that would be, something included with that would be, a one world language? Right now, it seems like English would be the best candidate for that. It's spoken all over the world. It's pretty utilitarian. There's different degrees that you can learn it and still communicate pretty effectively with people. Even that sentence, there are varying degrees that you can learn English and communicate effectively with people. I mean, you could say that same sentence and say, you could learn English good or bad and still talk either good or bad. There are simple, like easier ways that you can say things, or you can make it more complex. So it seems like English already has that, but there. We'll have to get to this in a minute, but there's actually something called Pidgin English now, which is a really it's like an infantile form of English, and that just makes me wonder, if people can learn that, why not just learn English? But all that aside, Isaac Newton. I want to talk about Isaac Newton and his attempt at a universal language, which he ended up abandoning. Then I want to talk about this Pidgin English thing, and then I want to talk about some other examples throughout time of different attempts of trying to develop this universal language, even using music and using colors. One guy tried to develop this language that he said he received from a green alien or something. So we got to talk about all that. Now, some of this is going to be for members only, so if you haven't had a chance to already, make sure to go to dailyrenegade.com and become a member today.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the first half of this episode of the Sharpening Report. If you are a Bible-believing Christian who opposes the kingdom of darkness trying to run the world right now, then you are a renegade to the satanic system. We here at Daily Renegade wear that badge proudly. So, if you're a renegade as well and you want to see the rest of this video, head on over to dailyrenegade.com right now and get a membership today. Not only will you get the rest of this video, but you'll get our full catalog of Sharpening Report episodes and Daily Renegade update videos on topics such as Bible prophecy, science, technology, the Nephilim, aliens, and so much more. All of our episodes at Daily Renegade are early access, so as a member, you'll get the videos before anyone else does. Daily Renegade also offers videos not available anywhere else due to social media censorship. We also have a community page only for members where we can all fellowship together without fear of censorship. It's basically the best of Facebook and YouTube rolled into one without any of the garbage. Memberships are only $10 a month or $100 a year, and if you can do it, I suggest getting the $100 a year because it's cheaper in the long run, and essentially you get 2 months for free that way. So come join our family of renegades at dailyrenegade.com right now. The link is in the description below, and we'll see you there.